Okay, this lesson that I present to the Cornet Project class is also on behalf of my client, Landmark Missionary Baptist Church in Jacksonville, Arkansas, that currently faithfully assembles at 2200 Marshall Road. I went to that fellowship formally in 1987, June 14th, I believe it was, on the Lord's Day, June 14th. Anyway, I went there in good faith. And in 1983, I was there for my own wedding, of course, my wife's wedding, as I call it. And she had grown up there. In 84, I was there for my brother's funeral, which was very gracious of them to help. I had a dear pastor, Dr. William K. Roach, very godly, manly man, high integrity, things like that. So I returned there years later after trying to pastor a church that seemed to have just a few people there, but that seemed to be enough that really seemed to be allergic to integrity, discipline, structure, verse by verse, things like that. And then, of course, doing outreach and commuting back and forth from the seminary, it just seemed to be against the grain for a few there, for someone to come in and be so willing to do such due diligence. But I've been trained in several professions, consulting, both education and experience. So that training has really been helpful. But a few months before, somewhere in 1999, I was asked to serve as finance chairman. And that was really no problem, except that LBO, there was a Landmark Business Office, Landmark Baptist Church Incorporated, and there's a now defunct, failed deacon board. And they postured themselves as guardians of the church and kept an eye on things, which I don't know, I never noticed them keep an eye on much, but it was the way they'd present themselves. So they had this bad habit of always incriminating the office or implicating people. It was an us versus them. And, seeing that everywhere I've ever been, it was not unusual. But as I tried to make queries with the Landmark Business Office, it was like there was a gatekeeper, very dramatic, very emotional gatekeeper. And she was very dramatized and traumatized because I was just wanting to know why I couldn't take a finance report that the office produced and somehow match it to any known reality. And I'd go to the finance committee, and I had recommended certain people be placed on it, and they were professionals from the real world like I was, and really was supposed to just make everything easy. But it seemed to be they had very good questions, and I would just say, oh, I'll go get that and be right back. Well, that was strange because those are like triggers. When you work in an organization, people that posture themselves as the gatekeeper and make themselves a barrier to information, that's just behavioral concealment. So this is the Landmark's internal audit results, and I made an acronym to help you remember it, LIARS, so you won't forget. And I'm left now, the only person left there to deal with both the implicated business office and the failed legendary deacon board. So it's my wife's church, and I thought, well, I kept thinking this will be easy, so I asked the office to bring what would you call it, an internal audit team, and I'm the chairman of that. Co-chair was the new finance chairman. I made the former youth pastor office administrator give him a scope of authority so he could access things and pull together reports. And then a new office manager, which was the former pastor's secretary. And then, of course, we had multiple missionaries, 2 at the time. So we sent inquiries to them, specific data we needed. And here's what I extrapolated. I was never told any of this. I had to listen and do the things. So here I was placed as a finance chairman. barriers, drama, trauma. Our pastor left. Internal audit team formed by ethical chairman. This was just to build a baseline. If you've never been involved in anything that goes forward, it's like a mountain climber. They put a peg down in the side of the mountain so they don't go back down. They stay as high as they've reached. So we were just going to receive a baseline because several people on the committee had loved to criticize the office, but they didn't want responsibility for auditing. I said, well, no one has to. They can bring forth an internal audit results and show us their fiduciary stewardship. And why wouldn't they want to show that and assure everyone in the church? And why wouldn't the deacon board want to bring their plan for the church that they were saying they would never heard? It was kind of childish. It was a lot like Matthew 11. Jesus said, I'll have to liken this generation to children in the marketplace. So we paused all mission accounts. I immediately required, and all approved by the church, of course, all of this approved unanimously by the church. 2 checks, 2 signatures on all checks by the finance committee members, so they wouldn't have to ask about the money. They would be the ones authorizing it. That would detach correlation between the business office, and it would give a function and feedback for the finance committee to be engaged. We started something, a record, when the people counted the money. They would write down checks, cash, whatever, and then multiple signatures for multiple counters would be added and dated. And then we started auditing the deposit amount compared to what the counters record showed, because at one time, and no one knew we did it, and I didn't realize it would call for me to use my expertise in investigations, but we started counting it before the counters and witnessing it, and we found shortfalls and differences. So one of the people said, well, how are we going to, quote, catch them? Well, I really wasn't here to catch, since I'm trained and know that 94% of all problems are systemic. They're not really the people involved. But also know 80% of people, when they give an opportunity, will steal. And when circumstances such as opportunity and then pressure and then the detachment that comes, the emotional detachment, the competitive detachment. So when you're ever in an environment where it's us versus them, that is an environment that generates a frictive relationship that encourages and helps justify, well, they deserve me taking this, or they don't deserve to know, or whatever you call those childish things. But then the biggest trigger was exculpatory stories. I mentioned this, my wife's church is in an association, American Baptist Association. It's like Baptist, BMA, ABA, SBC's convention, and there's independent fellowships, whatever all that is. But this one, they have like nationwide, a national softball tournament, which to me, that was benign. So I'm with my son, and he's like an athlete, and he was in sports and things. Of course, I was in things, but it was called martial skills, not martial arts. They just choreographed. They dance today, looks to me like, and wear different colored belts. But I was highly favored to be there when it was still a sport, and was on a judo team in University of Arkansas. But that's another story. But I'm walking along thinking this will be a nice, cute place to walk around, and I'm with my son. But there's a fella there that just, I saw him and I said, hey, how you doing? And boy, he, like a toad, lashed out at me in public in front of these people. And he said, you cut off money to missionaries, which I learned later from my wife, who told me to ask around. But apparently in the missionary Baptist churches, ABA, associated together, to be accused of cutting off missionaries, that's like a death knell, because who would do that? I don't know. We didn't do it. But being able to take it, because I didn't really feel much, nothing conveyed to me, I asked him why he would say that. Because I thought, how did he know we paused these accounts? We're waiting on data from missionaries. I'm waiting on office administrator and an office manager to pull this data together. Of course, I didn't notice the delay. It didn't seem to have anything to do with me. But the new finance chairman said we have to stop. But what has happened, I'll show you the arithmetic, for example. I'll just take Mr. Missionary number 1. Missionary agreements, something some churches may not do. But we had a missionary agreement. And you'll be trained on this in the seminary. I know Dr. Lynn Rayburn wrote an excellent book. But you have a missionary agreement. Missionary agreement. And ours was that I think at that time, years and years ago, the salary for missionaries, for example, I think was approximately $2,500 monthly. Yeah, that's it. So Landmark Baptist Church had agreed to guarantee, let's say, $800 monthly. And then missionary, I'll just put Mr. Missionary. He was, I guess you call it through deputation or something, $1,700, and that would give him his total of $2,500. Yeah. So what was happening is we had two incomes, and this is based on the office manager, who again, as she continued to decompose, she couldn't refrain herself, and certainly didn't have the professionalism in the office to not be one day on the phone asking Mr. Missionary, well, which account do you want this placed into? Well, I learned then, as someone who was quite unexpectedly, that is, quite surprised to notice that this really didn't function. There was conflicts of interest, pressure on the new finance chairman, who was practically related to the former secretary. Instead of this being gathering data, which would be basically a task driven, I had no idea that there was so much emotion to try to cover up. Well, what would it be? And I had no idea the person that lashed out at me at a silly baseball game was so ignorant that the last thing you do is create an exculpatory story. Because my son said, Dad, what was that about? I said, well, son, as a professional, I'll tell you that means there's an exculpatory story out there. He said, what's that mean? I said, well, someone has created a story to exculpate, that is to allow themselves to come out from a condition of culpability. He said, what's that mean? I said, well, apparently us, Landmark, who asked this group, said they weren't ready to take action. So the church agreed with me, the ethical finance chairman, who was interim pastor, and now the pastor said, well, we'll just pause everything, waiting on all the data. So what happened is one income would come in and it would say, Mr. Missionary. And then a second one would come in and it would say, no, this would say Landmark Baptist Church, and this one would say Mr. Missionary. Okay, so income 2 that had his name on it, this one would go to a bank somewhere. And income 1 would come here to Landmark, and that'd be reported to Landmark, who continued month after month, bless their hearts, month after month. There was Landmark every month. But you know, if you're gonna do this to people, you might want to change that number up sometimes, you know. But they were always afraid to not report more than this, because they then would be fair and just in their relationship with Landmark and begin to grow independent as far as the salary, and Landmark would move that money into another missionary endeavor. So that was something that I had not even imagined. And like I said, if it wasn't for I call them the leftover staff. Yeah, the leftover staff. They just were goofy. The emotions were overwhelming. I guess that's what paranoia does. When you present yourself as bastions of integrity and truth, and it was back to that game. But the only reason this lesson's being taught is because if you're part of a church, as my father had joined Landmark just months before he died, he always discouraged me. He said, don't get involved. He said, don't get involved in a church. Don't go into the ministry. Well, I had already begun working there on staff as a teaching pastor, and I was working 9 days a week. That is 7 days a week, more than 12 hours a day. But I could come and go as a manager and meet my responsibilities at the church and work on outreach. And it was great. It was a win-win. All this happened, though, quite unexpectedly because, again, Landmark Baptist Church, that is the business office, would produce a financial report. And it was striking because the dear manager, long after the pastor left, came in shortly after and left a piece of paper on the desk, said it was a finance report, said, when you're finished with it, let me have it and I'll make the changes and make copies. And I said, what would I do with it? Remember, I was only the finance chairman, multi-degree professional, manager in a large area department at a company, trained by men of great excellence, great responsibilities, investigated injuries, bottlenecks, workflow, products, machines that are damaged, even explosions, and all types of things, and personnel matters. There's nothing that I wasn't involved in. And I mean on the actual real world level. So I said, well, how would I know what to write on a finance report? Well, remember, they're not professionals. They're leftover staff. They're decomposing. They're spending more time trying not to be caught. And this fellow, who's friends of the former pastor, didn't have the character to at least conduct himself in a more advantageous manner to help perpetuate the concealment. But I lose my voice a lot. But the scam, and what was sad about it, is my wife's church was faithful to keep giving this, and then the deacon board had their reasons. It's called social currency, to not let this just blow up in their face because they'd be quite embarrassed presenting themselves. And the office had no incentive to disclose before they had already spent, let's say, approximately 6 months before our pastor left, blocking my access to information so that I could go to a finance committee meeting as a professional and have some intelligibility about what I was presenting. But they would ask me questions and I couldn't tell them about any of the accounts. It would be a number there on a piece of paper. Some of you may not remember, but at one time when the computer first came out, you could print a report. You could still do it. So you get a Word document, print a report, and just make copies. And unless someone pursues that. So it was interesting. They'd already acquainted themselves with blocking access to me, which that's a trigger, and presenting more drama and traumatizing. Here I was taking care of all these people left behind, so many people, older people, assisted living. I would be at a hospice consultation making final decisions or helping someone transition from their home to assisted living, which was always very traumatic and upsetting. Funerals, weddings, ordinances, baptism, Lord's Supper, consulting families, counseling, a marriage, trying to save it, accounts of infidelity, or counseling a family for a child that stepped off the path, trying to help them reconcile, help keep them engaged and going forward in the faith. And all the time that was happening and working on outreach, I had no idea that this was even possible. But what's so heinous about the scam is there's no one that could possibly know this was taking place. So if you do an internal audit, let's say at a church where you're attending in good faith, for example, they'll only show you, you'll only have the report they give you. And if the person inside the office, which I recently heard of someone, a saint who was working in an office and they were removed, and I thought, that's odd. That's a trigger to me because they were one of the most ethical people I knew. And of course, their spouse also departed, which was strange because they were high ethics. And so you have to find someone that's, like I said, on the inside, but if they had the character to disclose it, they wouldn't have ever participated in the concealment. So it's quite a walking contradiction. Again, not needing a career, because if you know, in this class we do word studies, right? So I always like to tell people that for a lot of pastors, their interest is their own rear, like the hireling. They want to save themselves. So my disappointment was for the saints there. That well, one lady, she went home, had her home going 2 years ago. She had been at our church 65 years, and they'd already been disappointed. Pastor left them in the 70s and left them disillusioned, deliberately divided deacon board, disillusioned congregation. They were already dealing with trauma of a building selling or not selling and new land acquired, and it was just, they couldn't take it. Now, for me, the degree of difficulty, if you've been part of this class at all, the last thing you'd want to do was bring in someone like me, not only ethical, but trained in investigations. And the last thing, again, it would not be good to do any of these, to have a gate set up to try to bar me access from information. And then knowing that I would take a systemic approach, which they weren't ready for that. I mean, to set up an internal audit committee, which is what you need to do, you need to have it consist of, and the office administrator, the new one, former youth pastor, had been there 10 years approximately. This dear person had been there for probably a dozen years. They couldn't seem to ever have anything to say, contribute to help bring light to what we were asking. And then I realized during all this that rather than a deacon board bringing their plan and bringing all the church on board with what they said, they always, they just said they were being ignored, whatever that means. So as any consultant, you'd bring in your warring factions and say, hey, get us all on the same line, baseline, we'll all go forward. And they reneged on their word, didn't keep it. So they stepped down. I accept their resignation from their work and function as deacons. And then the business office never gave me the information. Even when I was on staff, all I got was a very pretentious, dramatic gatekeeper. So it was really sad for those people there, because I watched some of them, give their money. One lady had been there over 40 years, Sister Vida, and we were preparing her services for her funeral. And in the mail, we received her little check, her offering that she had mailed. And it was the old mail. You'd put it in an envelope and go out to the mailbox and mail it. And another lady was dying of cancer, and we were preparing her funeral, making arrangements in the service. And her little tithe check, they call it, came in. So that's another thing is Landmark Baptist Church would put their tithes and offerings into the business office. And of course, we had monies deposited into accounts that weren't Landmark, so Landmark couldn't access it. Money unaccounted for. One account was over $13,000, and no one would tell us. That is, no one in the office that was the lost staff, the leftover. They couldn't bring any information from the former pastor because he had plenty on his plate with trying to pastor and commute to a new location, and he still lived in town. But again, my naivete was that everybody would come together and we'd all meet, and the deacons would present their plan, and the business office would present all their transactions and account management maneuvers and strategies. And but I've rather begun to suspect there's a problem with a finance chairman. And I was Minister of Education Outreach, teaching pastor, couldn't get any information. And as a church member, that's quite disconcerting for me, because I don't appreciate people who can be more emotionally affected, can be scarred mentally, emotionally, psychologically. They can have their faith shipwrecked. Some went to their graves disillusioned over everything. One lady, St. Sylvia, she died on Mother's Day, and that Lord's Day, it was on the Sunday, and that morning I received a call, and I had to go into the services, and it's the first time I ever preached without her, and I went a year without wearing a tie because she seemed to be the only one left that cared if I did. And but I was just, she could have not borne it mentally. She couldn't have taken her mind could not have accepted that. It was difficult enough when she watched deacons who had gained and garnered their trust, if you will, and then just walked away and let their buildings sell and just hoped that it all fall apart. But the church in the middle is all I was here and cared about. But so Landmark was faithful in their agreement to keep matching the 800, but monies weren't. And I could make this board 5 different ways. A youth account, 225 was placed in it every month, and yet 165 was used for nothing youth related. So that's enough to say. And this is just what I could extrapolate, because I was busy in school, seminary, went to graduate school at the seminary. I was dealing with people's lives that were really, some people had received terminal diagnoses. So the attorneys made it clear to me that my fiduciary responsibility was first and foremost to Landmark Baptist Church, and I could put this off as long as I needed to. But I noticed no one ever picked it up. No one ever came along and said, "Hey, Pastor, we'll get this." No, the conflict of interest between a deacon board, which is a comical thing. I don't know why we ever had that. It somehow formed as pastors were banished and sent away. And they had a strategy. They'd stand up in front of the church, say it's us or him, and somewhat of a bully type. And the church could never imagine, well, how would we function without them? It's always that illusion of consequence. And when I saw them try to mentally molest the congregation, and I saw our business office contribute to this people's emotional terror, if you will, and give them disconcerted hearts and bring them turmoil, when the Bible says we're here to feed the sheep and lead them to green pastures and still waters. So I would have to tell St. Sylvia, I'll use her example. She represented these dear people, but she would cry her eyes out worrying about me, and I would laugh and I'd say, "Oh, St. Sylvia, don't worry about me. I'm a professional, highly skilled, trained." She didn't know what that meant. She had never had a pastor who wasn't, I guess, susceptible. But I grew up in this area and watching people, and then working in organizations and having a degree in organizational management, a background with education with engineering, and then education with an experience in consulting and education. And it's just, I hated it for them to think that this goofy, low degree of difficulty strategy, it's as silly to somebody like me. I mean, the deacon board was worried what would it look like in the community, and I'm not sure I understand it, but everyone had conflicts of interest or something at stake that had nothing to do with the congregation, the flock. And God, by giving me that honor, I certainly wasn't looking to be so moved by the plight of a flock of sheep. And it just broke me how they were so susceptible to these things. And a dear man, Jay, out there in his house after his wife died, he was all alone, isolated, socially deprived. It'd take almost an hour talking with him to finally get all of his right and left brain connected and get talking again. And we'd go over there and have breakfast with him and try to keep him engaged. And he started giving his testimony and started giving some experiences he had at our church. And not all of them were good. And I said, "Oh, well, all that's behind us now." And I had opportunity after opportunity to assure people, elders especially, that, "Oh, it's all over now. Don't worry about it." And I was wrong on both counts. The deacon board deliberately disappointed them, not caring. And the business office likewise, trying to work out something. So I put this together as best I could. I had files and so, but I didn't take off work to pastor to then leave off pastoring to work on that. So if I had any more insight at the few months I was working as finance chairman, I would have started all this as the associate pastor while having my career and having less disruption to my own family and our own expense. Because Landmark, for example, my wife's church has never paid me in a week what I could make in a weekend, but that's not their fault. It's just I wasn't looking to, as I said, I wouldn't have walked away from selling lemonade to deal with something as goofy as this. But churches out there, if you're ABA, BMA, Independent Baptist, SBC, whatever you are, if you don't know where monies are going, or you can't do a one-for-one direct correlation with the finance report and account, you might read, let's say, a particular title, let's say, Joy Group. We have a Joy Group, and you might read that they have $2,500, but when you go ask, well, where's the Joy Group account? Well, it doesn't exist. It was just another way to place something on a report that corresponded to no particular route. But all that's gone now. The deacons all take their assignments with great responsibility and honor. All the heads of the households are honored to be responsible for their own families and as a covenanted community to take responsibility collectively and all for their buildings, their budgets, their lands, their finances, the well-being, mental well-being, spiritual well-being, and physical well-being of their families and those who come there in good faith. So if you attend our fellowship in good faith, as people often do, you won't run into social antics, you won't run into improprieties, and you won't hear anybody question the integrity of the pastor, because it's not possible. There's a firewall between the pastor and the finance. As a matter of fact, I don't even know what the offering was last week, and I wouldn't have to know. I tell them all the time, the days of such passive, indifferent, irresponsible men have been gone since July 9th, 1999. So you have a blessed day, and this is the best I can do. When I get it all formalized, it'll be like a whole chapter in my book, my memoirs, and I'm trying to write a book called Social Church Southern Style. It's just too hard to believe if you think about it. So my voice is going. I'd rather save it for something more important like teaching the Bible and not disclosing. But this is to warn people. If you don't know what's going on, it's because you step back, and every step removed you are from what's taking place in your church. You're nurturing and fostering an environment that could later hurt a lot of good people, like a Vida who sends her money, a Lucille who sends her money. I'd go see St. Sylvia, and she would have a little check there and would try to get it to me. And I'd say, oh, wait till Kevin comes over. He was a deacon, her deacon. He took care of her and helped her a lot. Because I said, don't hand me any money. I said, those preachers don't serve here anymore. So now we have, it was a joy to her, and she'd give it to him. And I'd say, Kevin, you go by, she's trying to give me money. And he would laugh, and he'd go by and see her. She loved the fellowship. So if you ever done anything for someone, you couldn't do anything more blessed and more important or significant than give a dear saint who comes to your fellowship in good faith, a peace of mind and a comfort of their heart and a calmness in their spirit. So you have a blessed day, and extend that grace to others and give them love and kindness and confidence that what they're participating in isn't some kind of game. And if you're a goofball like this guy who assaulted me verbally, I mean, that put it over the top right there. When people are already out telling exculpatory stories, like I said, somebody asked me, aren't you afraid of reporting things that you learn about? No, I've already let all that happen. Character assassination, slander, defamation, all that is indicative of you need to keep investigating, because something's off mark if all that noise out there. And being a professional, multiple income streams, multi-degree trained professional, a lot of experience, I don't know what it is to have a need for social currency, because I'm competent, have marketable skills, and do my diligence to be faithful as a steward. So I guess if you're unable to function and to be a contributor and producer and make a difference, I guess you have to, go to the lowest rung on the ladder, like Pharisees, Sadducees, and care what people think about you and make a show in the flesh and present yourself as something you could never otherwise be. So have a blessed day, and pass this video along. Warn your friends. Tell them, look, we might not be getting all the data. We might not know about accounts that the church doesn't have access to. We might not know about why merchant accounts are set up where bills are being paid by the church, but no one knows where the products or services went. So have a blessed day and enjoy this landmark internal audit results by the only person left standing from all the Finance Committee, all the deacon board, and all the office staff. So have a blessed day.